So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fourth session in our Water and Growth series. Over the next several months, and back, of course, starting back in March, we've had a number of speakers already. But over the next several months, Council will be hosting a number of forums to discuss water and growth in our community. Tonight's presentation will be approximately 1 hour with a question period to follow. Just a quick aside, as I said already, we've got that prize table set up, so please remember to enter your name for the draws, and if somebody else comes in, sits beside you, just whisper to them, make sure they've entered also. Now, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Susan Richstone, the highly respected Comprehensive Planning Manager in the Department of Community Planning and Sustainability for the City of Boulder, Colorado. Susan has 30 years of experience as a city planner. She has worked for the City of Boulder since 1995, and prior to that, held a variety of planning positions for the City of Aurora and for Adams County in Colorado. Susan has a bachelor's degree in geography. That must be a great degree. That was my first degree. She holds hers from the University of Colorado in Boulder and studied for her master's degree in urban and regional planning at the Technion in Israel, where she also worked as an environmental planner for 3 years before returning to Colorado. Ladies and gentlemen, Susan Richland.
Thank you so much. First of all, for inviting me to come here. I have to say I haven't been to this area of North America for over 30 years, and it's as beautiful as I remember. I spent the afternoon, I got here several hours ago and had a chance to walk around your lovely community, and I was really impressed by what a lovely place it is to live. So I understand why so many people want to live here, and I also understand the challenges facing you, because I think Boulder has a lot of relevance in terms of some of the experience we have, and actually I think you're in somewhat of a similar place in your evolution and some of the challenges you have to deal with as we were 30 years ago. I think we're in a pretty different place now. So after having a chance to talk with your council members, I think there's a lot of relevance here. I also have to say I'm very impressed that all of you came out, because very similar climate here to Boulder. You're a lot colder in the winter, but you know, we're just east of the Rocky Mountains, and we are also blessed with beautiful, sunny, dry days like this, and I think it's hard to come inside, so I really appreciate your coming here on such a beautiful evening. Just a few observations. I was thinking about it as I was on the plane this morning. I think our community, some of the similarities we have is this. First of all, I was very impressed when I went on the website and learned a little bit about Okotoks and saw your commitment to sustainability. You've really integrated that into your philosophy of how you want to approach your community and your future. And Boulder's the same way. In fact, it was pretty funny to me when I saw Sustainable Okotoks, since we just finished a major update to our comprehensive plan, and the title of it was Sustainable Boulder. So that commitment to sustainability, the integration, as you saw in the name of our department, is really a core value of our community also. Obviously our location, adjacent just east of the Rocky Mountains, and adjacent to such beautiful natural beauty. The growth pressures, again, for us, although we still have them, they really were more similar to the ones you're experiencing. For us, it was in the early 70s that we were in somewhat, I think, of a similar position, and grappling with the whole issue of providing adequate urban services, water, sewer, et cetera, to your community in a thoughtful and planned way. So I really also applaud you for the series of speakers you're bringing in and the thoughtfulness with which your community and your elected officials are trying to tackle this issue, and I think that's a similarity with us. So in terms of the presentation, the title is, well, I think it was actually called Finite Growth, but I changed a little Managing Growth, since I think that's more descriptive of Boulder's actual experience, vision versus reality. So the first thing I have to do is a little bit of a disclaimer to say one of the sort of the sayings about Boulder is that we're actually 25 square miles surrounded by reality, because Boulder, for those of you who may not know the community, is a fairly liberal enclave in Colorado, which also has other liberal areas, but for the most part tends to be fairly conservative in certain parts of the state. So we're seen as actually not quite reality within our borders. And we take that as a compliment. So let's see if we can go on. Just in case you don't know where Boulder is, as the crow flies, we're really 900 miles due south of Calgary, in the middle of the country. So again, geographically, I think a lot of similarities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Boulder just to orient you, because I don't want to assume that you're familiar with the community. So another similarity, it's about 40 kilometers to downtown Denver. So we're a separate community, but we're pretty close to Denver, main city of actually over 1 million with its region, but the city itself is just under 1 million. We're a city today of about 100,000 residents within the city boundaries. Of course, the Front Range urban area of Denver and the greater Front Range of Colorado has over 4 million these days, but Boulder maintains its separate community identity. Today, this isn't the way things were 30 or 40 years ago. We actually have about 100,000 jobs within the community. So we are a job center, because a population of 100,000, you have children, you have retired people. So about half of the people who work in Boulder on a daily basis are commuting in. And then we're about 63 square kilometers of urban area, of city, with 180 square kilometers of open space that's actually owned by the city. And that's a big, I'm going to talk more about our open space program, but that is a big part of our growth management strategy. We are fortunate to have a thriving economy. Obviously not as thriving as it might have been a few years ago, but compared to most of the region, country, North America, in terms of the last few years. The University of Colorado, which has almost 30,000 students, grad and undergrad, is in the city of Boulder. So we are a university community that defines a lot of who we are, and that's obviously a bit different than your community. We have, in the 60s, a number of federal labs located in Boulder: the National Center for Atmospheric Research, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Again, all related to university, and we have a very science, technology-based type of industrial base. Science, technology, aerospace. We are an active living center, a lot of elite athletes and outdoor, we are sort of a outdoor culture and a real epicenter of the natural and organic foods industry, medical, and in recent years, the whole clean tech, green energy sector. Over 60, about 6,600 corporations. So we are very blessed with a healthy economy compared to most places in recent years. This is a picture of Chautauqua, which is a wonderful National Historic Landmark District located adjacent to the Flatirons. Those are the three sort of Flatiron Mountains that are the iconic mountains just at Boulder. The reason I'm showing this is because I just want to make the point to start with that Boulder has this long history and legacy of thoughtful planning, and it goes back before we did any growth management in the 70s. It goes back really to over 100 years ago. I mean, Boulder's citizens, the natural beauty around our community has always really been precious to those who live in the community. And back in the late 1800s, a ranch was purchased on the west side of town, and actually the citizens voted to bond to purchase more of the land to prevent the development of pieces of the mountain backdrop. And we, following that, around 1900, actually even petitioned the federal government for about 1,800 acres. So that concern for preserving the place goes back a long time, and our willingness of our citizens to take action and bold action to do that is sort of a part of our, almost a part of our culture. So I want to talk first and set a little context in terms of growth management, because that's what I was asked to come here to talk about. I think this is a fairly compelling visual. The areas, they're sort of washed out on the screen here, but it's actually yellowish is the areas within our city. There's two separate areas there, and that's a story in and of itself I'm not going to explain right now. But those are incorporated areas, more or less, and include what I'm going to call our service area that I'm going to explain later. So it's basically the areas within that yellowish area, I guess it doesn't look very yellow up there, are our urban growth boundary. What surrounds them is the urban growth boundary. And then the green area, again, it's a little washed out, is the area that's not designated for urban development. It's in the county, and it's designated to remain in the county. And the outer boundary of that is really the outside of our joint planning area with the county, which again goes back to the 70s, and I'm going to talk about a little further. But I think what you get there is this very strong visual of the fact that the essential development pattern of our community is a compact city surrounded by open space. And that is really, it was a vision that was set in place in the 70s, and it has really become a ingrained community value. That we would be a separate community, that we would have compact development, that we would be what we call urban to the edge. We don't feather out in densities. Most communities go dense, lower, lower. Ours was urban, cost-efficient provision of services, and then rural. Now, that green, I'm going to talk about in a little more detail. It doesn't mean it's all purchased open space. It's not. There's actually lower density subdivisions in some of that area and development within the county. This represents the policy framework, that that's an area where urban development is not going to be approved. Let's see here. And I want to touch, I'm going to come back to some of these, but just to set the context, I want to also talk about a few key actions that took place over our history, because one of the key points I want to make is it isn't about one particular solution or action that a community takes. It's a comprehensive strategy. It doesn't happen in a day. It gets built over time. But it's really necessary to put a whole number of pieces in place, and things evolve over time depending on circumstances, changing needs, and community desires. And really the origin, in a way, of growth management in Boulder, I think, started in 1959 when there was a citizen initiative, which means citizens actually can go out and get a certain number of signatures based upon which an item can get put on a ballot and the community can vote. And so through citizen initiative, an initiative was put on the ballot called the Blue Line, where we created, and it's basically that edge next to the green of our community on the western side. It was based on an elevation primarily and a ditch that's there, but basically prohibited the city from extending water service above that elevation. So in other words, really, except for some county homes that existed up there, really preserved the mountain backdrop. That was in a way the beginning of our open space program and the beginning of growth management in some form. Then in 1967, we became the first community in the United States to vote to tax itself and put in place a 1%, 1 cent on the dollar sales tax to purchase open space and develop an open space system. It was called Green Belts for Boulder at the time. It was about preserving open space, and it was this very strong vision of maintaining us as a separate community from the communities around us, and doing that through the best way, which was not relying on by purchasing property. And of course, we didn't purchase all that property, but I'm going to show you how we built that system over time. And we were the first to do it, but it has been a model for many communities after us. In 1971, we actually put a 55-foot height limit in place, again, citizen initiative. So that's basically 4 stories. It could be 5 if it's residential, not if you really have commercial. And then there also was an initiative on the ballot where the community voted to have some form of residential growth management. We had very aggressive growth in the 60s. We were a community of about 33,000 in 1960, and in 1970, we had doubled. We were over 66,000. And our community really reacted to that, felt there was way too much quick growth going on, and they went to the ballot, which is what you can do in the US, and asked our leaders, our civic leaders, to put in place a system that would limit the rate of residential building permit issuance. It started at first in the early, there was actually a growth commission met for years to look at how to do it, but in the end there was a 3% growth limit at first. So in other words, of the number of housing units in the city, only 3% per year additional could be built each year. That was later changed to 2, because it didn't really have that much effect. And it was also the way you got a permit. It wasn't just you came in if you were first in line. It was actually a beauty contest. You had to accumulate points. So there were ways to accumulate points. So it was also a way for us to get quality growth. Because, for instance, one of the aspects that was of concern in the community at the time was during the quick growth of the 60s is homes were getting built so fast by large production builders, and the community didn't like that. So there were a whole bunch of points of quality in terms of getting your permit. And then we went to an actual allocation system. We went to a 2% growth rate and an allocation system where you could only get a certain number each year. And although it wasn't put out there, it was sort of about equity. But that was actually a technique to sort of work against some of the very large production builders. And then we eventually went to a 1% growth rate. And we still have that in place today, but it's really actually not effective. And it's really not operating as a growth management system anymore because our actual rate of growth is much lower than that. But in certain ways, we really don't even need it anymore because we don't have the vacant land we had at the time it was put in place. What capped things off in our growth management and established this urban growth boundary was a partnership with the county and actually an intergovernmental agreement and a joint plan that went into effect. The intergovernmental agreement in 1976 and a joint plan in 77, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because that was really a seminal date in our growth management history. This is just sort of a view from one of the pieces of our open space to the southeast, so you get that sense of, although we're an urban city, larger and much more, dense than Okotoks, all around our city you can get solitude. So this is the basis of our growth management system in a way, physical growth management system and urban growth boundary. It's what was called the service area concept, and what happened, just to give a little bit of historic perspective here, is if you had looked at our comprehensive plan in the 1970s, in 1970, it was built on a model of we can't really prevent growth. We can plan for it. It was happening in the county. So there was actually what was called the spokes of the wheel, where we agreed that we were going to extend our water and sewer out these major corridors, one to the northeast, that's a transportation corridor, one to the east and one to the south. It's called spokes of the wheel. And the philosophy was we can't prevent it. We'll have it be our urban services, and we'll only give our water and sewer with an agreement that these areas are going to annex when we get there. And so it was really this vision of continual expansion. And our community really moved against that in the late 60s and early 70s when we put in place rate control and then put in place this service area concept and the intergovernmental agreement. And what precipitated this was, instead of approving out-of-city utility permits for water and sewer for homes that went up in the county, we just said no one day, and we were taken to court and we lost because we had water lines out there, we were found to be a monopoly by the courts, and it was county land use jurisdiction there, not out city, so the court found that we had inappropriately used our water and sewer utility powers to control land use. So based on that, we sat down with the county. We did this intergovernmental agreement and really intensely worked on looking at where our water and sewer line were, what areas we could logically accommodate and expand services over time, and what areas really should not become urban in the future. And that was the basis of what became this Area 1, 2, 3 map with yellow areas. This is how it looks today. Yellow areas in the city. The brown are actually, that's Area 1. Area 2 are areas within the county, but that are within the city service area that we plan to provide services and that are planned for annexation to the city. And then Area 3 are all those other lands in green that the city and county agreed would retain their rural character. Now, there was a lot of development already out in that green area. Rural subdivisions, industrial development, even some commercial. the county actually came back in the mid-'80s. This was 77 when we put this together, and actually downzoned some of those lands. They were sued. It was really quite a contentious time for them, but it was really amazing that they actually tried to implement the plan as best they could. So there are rural subdivisions out there that were existing, but the county stopped approving additional ones. And you could only get urban densities of development if you were within the city's growth boundary in our service area, and the county would not approve it. If people wanted urban services and urban development, they have to come to the city. So it was very effective. And over the last 30 years, originally, all those lands, the brown, there was a lot more brown. There was a lot of vacant land. And in the 70s and in the 80s and even into the 90s, we continued to grow at our 2 and then 1% growth rate. And the vacant lands all annexed to the city. Most of the remaining lands in brown are not vacant. They're actually those areas that the city had extended services back in the 60s, and they're residential developments, and they really don't want to annex to the city at this point. They have their water and sewer. But they are within our service area, and they do have city water and sewer. When we originally put this in place, I don't think everybody who was involved necessarily thought that our urban growth boundary and our service area wouldn't continually expand. But what happened in our community is this vision of a compact community surrounded by open space is such a compelling vision to our community, and they've so bought into it that really there has been zero support for expanding that out. And so over the years, we're basically at this point in time a community without any vacant land left, and we are infilling and redeveloping and densifying in certain locations. And that's a bit of another story I'll talk about as we go along. Let's see. What I did want to mention also is that the issues really changed over the years. So residential growth, just like it is the issue for you today, was the issue that there was support for managing, and that we put in place both an urban growth boundary and rate control to manage. What happened is we continue to have, more or less a 1% growth rate in residential, but in the 80s and the 90s, our employment growth absolutely skyrocketed. Back in the 70s, when we put residential rate control in place, we did not have a lot of jobs in the community. It was 20-something thousand. I mean, when you would graduate from college like I did in the 70s, unless you were a geologist or someone in the extractive industries, or you were a university professor or a scientist, you were working at a restaurant. There were not jobs for, people had to leave to get jobs. That really changed. Boulder has had we have been fortunate to have a phenomenal economy. What were at one time warehouses and low intensity industrial uses became hotbeds for software and high tech and knowledge-based industries. So employment growth started skyrocketing in the 80s, and in the early 90s, what happened is our community, residential rate control in a way was an old issue. It was just accepted. We were controlling the rate of growth, but we had never controlled non-residential growth. And that, for us, became the issue of the 90s. All that job growth led to a high acceleration in housing prices. People were commuting in. They were living further and further away. As a community, we were feeling that was compromising our sense of community when so many people are coming in just to work and then leaving at night. And that, very honestly, the whole issue of jobs, housing balance for us became the issue of the 90s. And we actually wound up through a citizen initiative, I'm going to show a slide later on, where it put pressure on the council where they actually put in place non-residential growth management for a short period of time. So a little bit of an unusual circumstance that I don't know that any other communities have ever really experienced. So I saw on your website that you had a lot of 10s in your sustainable Okotos, 10 things you can do, 10 things about sustainability. So I thought I'd do this in terms of 10 lessons learned from our experience that might have some relevance for you. I'm probably going to be picking up on a lot of the same points I talked about, but a little bit differently. So the first one, and I won't read them all because I'm going to go through them, but the first one is, it's really all about placemaking. I think first and foremost, when we talk about the future of our communities, it's all about creating a great place. I mean, that's why you're here. You love this community. It has a great quality of life. And so it's how do we keep that wonderful sense of place that's meaningful for us and that represents the values of our community over the long term. And this is a quote. I don't know if any of you know who Richard Florida is. He wrote The Rise of the Creative Class, and he has a newer book that's really about the locational choices and what are the places that basically have locational advantage. It's this whole idea that others have talked about, that in the new millennium, that place is really what gives a community competitive advantage, that people are looking for authentic places, places with high quality of life. A lot of people today, the nature of their work is such that they're a little bit more footloose and fancy-free and can choose those. So his quote is, "Boulder has reached this beautiful sweet spot where it has many advantages of a university town, tech, talent, openness, but without many of the costs and traffic and congestion that may disadvantage incumbent centers of innovation." So we do have our problems, but we think we've actually have sort of reached a lucky sweet spot in many ways. I think this is sort of a compelling juxtaposition of two slides. On the left is Boulder in the 1870s, and you see the foothills and the mountains, and at that time, I don't know, we were maybe 3,000 or 4,000 people. And then here's Boulder today. You still have that same real sense of community in place. And it isn't that way all along the Front Range. A lot of other communities, they've mined, quarried on the mountain face that you can visually see. They've built up along. There were proposals, believe me, for an amusement park on top of one of these hillsides, foothills. So I think that's a pretty compelling juxtaposition to show how our overall form has not really changed. And I think the point I want to make here is you really need to have a long-term vision of where you want to be and take the long view. It takes a long time to put in place the open space system we have, or the bike system we have, or the other things. It's incremental. You have to sort of try and bring yourself beyond the issues of the day, although those are very important and you can't not deal with them, and try and have a vision of the type of community and where you want to be 30 years down the road. We'll get this. So we have, as I said before, a history of thoughtful planning, vision, and a comprehensive strategy. It's not just one piece. It's a whole multitude of things that work together, and that didn't happen in a day or a year or 10 years. It's evolved over time. The growth management system I talked about, open space preservation, very strong ethic and value of maintaining Boulder's unique sense of place, a partnership with the county, and I know from meeting with your council members, it's a big issue for your community of your metropolitan district and how you work with them. We were very fortunate to forge a partnership with the county because they could have approved development right on our fringe, and other communities in Colorado have that. And through an agreement, we agreed that we would work together and have a joint plan. That since '77, we have a joint plan that is approved by both jurisdictions. Either one has veto power over changes, and amendments have to be approved by both. We have separated a little bit that some issues are either purely county or purely city that don't interrelate. We've tried to separate a little bit so we don't have the complete approval, but that's been by agreement of both entities. Diverse mix of land uses, a hierarchy of centers. We have a pretty well-developed land use pattern within the city where we have regional centers and then more neighborhood commercial centers, so that we have multimodal corridors of transportation so that it's easy to get around and areas are accessible and you can get around by bike and transit and walking and don't always have to get in your car. Diverse and affordable housing is a very big issue for us because with so it's sort of the paradox. If you're really a desirable community, everybody wants to live there, and if everybody comes and lives there, usually you can't maintain that wonderful sense of place. So you have to make some trade-offs along the way, but definitely the job growth and our growth limits have put pressure on housing prices. Housing is expensive, and there is no more single-family land left. We are densifying into more multifamily, and that is a trade-off. So we have a very aggressive affordable housing program. Efficient infrastructure, the cost-effective infrastructure provision, planning ahead of time, not allowing growth to occur without concurrent urban services. And it's not just the extension of water and sewer, it's adequate parkland and rec centers and all that new growth contributes to the capital costs of all of those facilities, which is really a key component of effective planning and a multimodal transportation system. And these are just some compelling slides. So this is 1967, the open space I mentioned. We purchased some land back at turn of the century and got some from the government. That's the amount of city open space we had in 67 when we passed the Greenbelt tax. This is 1988, so 20 years later, and this is today, basically 40 years later. And this is only city open space or open space that city and county own together. In some cases, it's not, a lot of this is conservation easements where we would purchase a large tract of land, buy up development rights, allow the farm or ranch to continue to own and have their home, but they wouldn't have the ability to develop it into additional homes or sell it off for that. We have the conservation easement. And this doesn't show the county properties. They have an open space system too. This is only the city, and it would actually fill in a lot more properties to the north and west. So we really are a compact city surrounded by open space, but this is 40 years later, so aggressive but incremental, 40 years. So the commitment to the long term. And then it's sort of a similar series of slides on our bike trails, both on street and off street, where we are like one of the 3 top bicycle-friendly cities in the US. So we had a system in '89, but since then we've installed an average of 1 mile of off-street path and 1/2 mile of on-street bike lanes per year. In and of itself, that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you do it every year, you get a pretty amazing system at the end of the day. And that's us today. So that these series, I think, are incredibly compelling for sort of that issue of taking a long view. So that's the poster from back in '67, Greenbelts for Boulder. And the lesson here is it takes a village. So this didn't happen by accident. It happened because this is what the citizens of Boulder wanted, and really elected leaders who had the same vision, and had civic leaders who took bold steps. But a lot of things that happened, they came first from citizens who cared about the community and wanted to make sure that the quality of life was preserved. And every community is different, and need your planning and your the actions need to reflect the values of your community. And it pays. I mean, I can't keep up with how many awards we get. So, best cities for the next decade, best quality of life for mid-sized city, #1 town to live well, happiest, healthiest city, strongest housing market. That was just when most places in the US had horrible housing markets. Now we are blessed, like I said, with a healthy economy and stabilizing factors like the university and the federal labs, so it isn't best city to raise an outdoor child. There are trade-offs. There is no, when you take action, there's no ability to be perfect in every area. I think the point is, though, to make conscious choices and then course correct over time as needed, which is needed. And when we put limits on residential growth and then our job growth grew, we had very aggressive job growth, it resulted in spillover of housing into adjacent areas that actually resulted in the creation of a whole new community near us. And it also meant all the in-commuting and the traffic and pollution associated with that. We controlled the housing supply. It put pressure. We're more expensive than surrounding communities. Now, the alternative would have been to keep growing and growing and having housing on the edge. So, housing's really cheap in places where people don't want to live. So I guess if you ruin the quality of life, you can have cheap housing prices. But there are trade-offs, and we need to acknowledge them. We need to see what we can do about them. But there is no, every community has to make its own choices. And of course, since we set this urban growth boundary and then the vacant land was developed and we had all this high job growth, it created a whole different conversation in our community in the 90s, a community that for 20 years approving more residential growth, whether on the fringe or within the city, was a non-starter. Once we started having all this commuting in, the spillover effects to adjacent communities that weren't happy with us, they felt like we were getting all the economic benefits and giving the housing there, not caring about people having to commute in, congestion on the roads, costs to the county to improve the roads. Our community really looked at itself and said, wait a minute, we have all these jobs. We can't just say, go live elsewhere. People were starting to commute further and further out, and businesses were saying it's a real problem. People can't afford to live in the community. There's not a lot of housing options. So we had to really look at ourselves, and we changed our philosophy to say, we're not going to grow out, but we're going to grow up. And we're going to densify, not everywhere, not in our existing established single-family neighborhoods, but we created incentives to get housing in our downtown, which we thought was good for a number of reasons. We took areas that had previously been industrial and commercial and promoted mixed use, and we densified, we upped, we changed our zoning code to allow new higher density districts. We couldn't go above 55 feet, but we had really a community that wanted lower density, and we changed to put in higher density housing, and a lot of areas actually redeveloped. So, number one, you have to make there are trade-offs, but number two, you also have to adapt and change over time as conditions change. Planning, which is this one, planning is not once and done. So you go and you plan, but you plan again and you plan again because circumstances change. And you have to be nimble and you have to respond, whether it's to the economy, demographic changes. We are continually redoing things. I mean, downtown, when we had residential growth control, it was basically a commercial area. Then, with these issues in the 90s of wanting to find better places for housing, we also said we want more housing downtown. So we changed our zoning to set it up so there were density bonuses and incentives for housing. And we were successful. We got a lot of housing downtown. Right now, we're in the midst of changing that again to where that density bonus can also be for commercial uses, because we have a number of really desirable employers who are office-type users, high-tech. They want to be in our downtown. They love it, and we want to accommodate them, and we're better to do that than in your downtown. So we're changing that again. We don't change it every year or every 2 years, but maybe every decade. You have to be nimble and thoughtful about it, but you need to change. This is sort of a unique headline, so it's take your jobs and shove them. That was in Forbes magazine, and there were similar headlines all across the nation in the Wall Street Journal and whatever when we put in place in the mid-90s non-residential rate control. I mean, nobody could believe it. Like, what? You're limiting how much job growth you can have? So that, by the way, wasn't in place for very long. And then sustainability. The issue for us, and what we are really focusing on today, is the issue of balance. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not economy or environment. It's finding that sweet spot where you balance all of these different issues to have a truly sustainable community. So and I'm going to run briefly through these, but some of the areas where we are today in terms of trying to find that sweet spot in different areas are as follows. With our comprehensive plan update, there was a very big focus on trying to define what within our city is a sustainable development form. What does it really mean to have sustainable urban form? And a big community discussion, and part of our update was really to define for Boulder what sustainable development pattern within our city is. And it's, these obviously have more that go with them, but I'm just going to hit the high, which is it's compact, and it's connected, it's complete, meaning mix of land uses and easily accessible services wherever you are in the city. It's green, it's attractive, it's distinct, and it's inclusive. So that is what from not our new comprehensive plan, because we have a series of diagrams, but it does show that within the city, we also have a very organized urban form where we have our major roadways, and these are what we call also multimodal corridor, which is our goal that they all have some type of transit on them and usually have bike lanes too, as well as off-street bike lanes that go down our creeks and others. And we have a hierarchy of activity centers. So we have these regional red activity centers that are in the center of our community. We have our downtown, we have the university, and we have our regional sort of commercial area. Now there is some extension of those are areas, but it's a really clear pattern of development, and then neighborhood and community commercial centers within neighborhoods. And it served us very well over the long term, because then it's much more efficient in terms of transit, in terms of tend to have more density in those centers and mixed use before you get into the neighborhood, and you can really co-locate your services and your community facilities and create true activity centers. Urban design, we really have worked for a long time, and in many ways are a model of how to really integrate land use, transportation, parking. If you work in our downtown, you get an eco-pass, you get a bus pass. We have a very high rate of people who don't drive into our downtown. We manage and limit parking so people get there by other ways. If you're going to do that, not everybody bikes, not everybody can walk. You have to have a great transit system. So people actually get passes, and the parking revenues we get, because you have to pay to park, go into buying those bus passes for downtown employees. And then mixed use, we're sort of a model of sort of that mid-level mixed use, not high-rise, but 3-4-story mixed use in centers again. Affordability is a challenge. I think it is here too. I was actually surprised by your housing prices. They are far from low. Our median home price is above $500,000 for a single-family home. And we have, for new residential development, 20% has to be permanently affordable to moderate income persons, families. And we have a goal that 10% of all of the units in the city be permanently affordable. And we're not talking about low-income housing. To get low income, we have to subsidize it through a variety of means. This requires those units to basically be built at lower price points than what a developer would normally do, so that the nurses and the teachers and a lot of the people who make our city operate can afford to live in the city. And this issue of middle income affordability is one we're trying to grapple with. We do not have an answer. It is a trend across the United States. I don't know if it's the same in Canada, that just income, there is more and more disparity between those of lower income and those of higher income, and there is this loss, this trend towards loss of middle income. And what I'm showing here actually is a wonderful development in an area called the Holiday Drive-In, where the city purchased, together with a housing authority and some federal funds and city funds, a property that was a former drive-in, and it's been redeveloped for an incredible mix of housing where 50% of it is permanently affordable, and it's a wonderful, wonderful development. So another way we try and do it is we sometimes just buy land to help make things happen. So searching for sweet spots, I sort of mentioned them, which is on the urban form, is increasing density in specific areas, having a comprehensive approach to affordability. So if somebody can live without a car, they've saved a lot of costs. If they can get around easily to services, to the grocery store, you've created an affordable living situation. So it's looking at the full costs. Public-private partnerships, we're joint investors with our regional transportation district right now in a piece of property that's an old industrial area that'll be a new transit center on the eastern side of town. Affordable housing and mixed-use development actually just approved the first housing development, and it's a market rate development just a few months ago. We're very excited about it. So we try and partner to the degree we can to actually influence what happens by sometimes having financial interest in property. And a challenge we're dealing with is how we have sort of what we consider market rate affordable. There are units out there that just aren't that expensive in the community, and how do you, over time, try and, are there any interventions that would keep those at affordable rates over the long term? I talked about this a little bit. You know, another piece of sustainability is a robust multimodal system, as we have many miles of bike trails, and this is up near the university. That's one of our local transit network buses. We have a skip, a hop, and a jump that have high frequency service within the city, local service. That's the bound. So obviously transportation is key. If people can get around without their cars, it reduces pollution, reduces, you know, car trips. It's healthy, you know, to get around. If you're getting around bike, transit, walking, it encourages a healthy living style. It definitely supports social sustainability because people have a choice to drive in their car, lower expenses, and it all enhances economic vitality because having a good transportation system is really vital to our employers. And then on the climate action side, another area we've been very innovative in. We, in 2006, actually passed a climate action tax to implement a climate action plan. We have some very innovative programs in place where we help people improve the energy efficiency of rental units as well as home units that are owned. And we actually now have put in place requirements for rentals in the city. We have a lot of rental properties because of the university, and there now are in place actually requirements to improve the energy efficiency of those. As well as right now, probably the biggest issue in our community is we are looking at potentially municipalizing our energy supply. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but big issues for us right now are on this end. Lesson 8, learn from others, but don't copy. We're all unique places, and I think there's a lot to learn, a lot of relevance from Boulder, but obviously Okotoks is a different community with your own values, and it's great that you're bringing in people from all over to learn and see what makes sense, but every community has to do it their own way. This is a slide I love. On the left, it says maintain your own unique sense of place, but that's our Pearl Street downtown in the 1800s, late 1800s, and this is it today, where one of the innovative items we did is in '76, 4 blocks of our downtown were converted to a pedestrian mall, and it's a very, very successful pedestrian mall. But you can see that same essential sense of place is still there over 100 years later, and we've had significant development downtown. And this is our downtown mall. So no pain, no gain. You have to be, I think governments generally are risk averse, and you have to be cautious, you know, make reasoned risks, but you also have to be bold and take innovative actions, and I think we have, and I think it's paid off for us. Not always, but in many times it has. And then this is sort of my last one. It should be 10. I don't know what I lost along the way. Don't overly focus on numbers. These are newspaper articles when the citizens were initiating, the citizens of Boulder wanted to initiate non-residential growth control in the mid-90s, and our council took preemptive action and put in place a non-residential growth management system. That led to what I would call 10 years of overly focusing on the numbers. Our community became consumed by how many more jobs could you have if everything were to develop to its maximum capacity, and how do we reduce it? And it became very numbers focused. And don't get me wrong, we are a numbers obsessed community, and numbers are important, they inform decisions. But at the end of the day, it's about the outcomes you want and the policy issues. And I know Okotoks has your 30,000, growth limit, and or this idea of you want to be a community of 30,000. And we had the same community of 100,000, and by the way, that's what we are today, and that was sort of the idea 30 years ago. So it's not, but we didn't have an actual growth cap. I think we lost sight a little bit of the outcomes. We spent a lot of time and resources on trying to take those numbers down to a level that they weren't that meaningful anymore. We actually wound up, by the way, at the end of the day, no non-residential growth management system. We did a very controversial rezoning in the late 90s that actually downzoned all of our industrial areas so that they didn't have limits on how much you could build on a parcel. You just had to meet our landscaping standards and parking standards and all that. And we actually put limits in. And that was a way, politically, that the community could feel comfortable that we were limiting how large the community could become in terms of number of jobs. There's still a lot of opportunity for job growth, and we've had very healthy job growth. Today, in a lot of ways, a lot of our actions are in certain ways undoing that, because we have a lot of businesses that are local or that want to grow, that are important to us and that the community supports. So we're back now changing some of that. So it's not that anything we did was wrong, it's just that I think we could have spent, I think we just got too focused on the numbers as opposed to the outcomes we were trying to achieve. And I'll close with that beautiful picture.